All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to session 2 of our Healing the Hurt Forum today. My name's Claire Ryan and I'm the Clinical Practice Development Team Leader of Take 2. This is a 4-session forum. Some of you joining us now will have already been in the previous session. Some of you may be joining for the first time. So we've already had one session this morning, which is a bit of an overview around the complexities of working with a particularly, I guess, complex and challenging cohort of kids, infants, children and young people who have experienced often quite significant abuse, neglect and other types of trauma, and often who are living in out-of-home care. So we're hoping that this session will be another opportunity for people to listen to some of the practice that Take 2 has used with this, complex cohort of kids, and an opportunity for you guys to, I guess, listen to a conversation between 2 of our staff, and also for you to take away some ideas for your own practice at the end of that session. All of these sessions are being recorded, so please just be aware of that. And the purpose of the recording is to make it available to people afterwards and to make it available to people who haven't been able to join us today. The PowerPoints from this session won't be made available, but the PowerPoints from session 1, PDFs of those PowerPoints will be made available to people afterwards. We are talking about some clinical cases in the sessions today, so just be mindful that the clinical cases have been identified, and sometimes the example being presented is more of an amalgam of different clients together. So I would like to just move on now to acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're all meeting on today. I'm here on Bunurong country, but I'm aware that people have joined us from really across Australia. So I'd like to pay respects to all elders, past, present and emerging. And we recognise the strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So this session, I'd like to introduce our 2 presenters to you. We have Adam Dunn and Holly Mosse. So Adam is the clinical team leader of Take 2's Aboriginal team, and he's a clinical family therapist. And Holly Mosse is our assistant director of Take 2, and Holly is a psychologist. So during the presentation, we really encourage you to use the chat thread. So if you haven't opened up the Zoom chat thread, please do so. We really encourage people to use that to sort of post comments, post questions, etc. We will do our best to keep track of those comments and questions, and we're hoping that there will be some time at the end where I will put some of those comments or questions to Holly and Adam for their responses. Just in terms of the Zoom view, you can sort of select the view at the top right hand of your Zoom screen, whether you want to have sort of side-by-side or gallery view, etc. You can select what you're actually seeing. And we do have closed captions as an option for people as well. And my final comment is that we have, because we're talking about children and young people who have experienced significant adversity in their lives and the things that we really don't want to be happening to kids, I guess just a bit of a recognition that these things can have an impact on you listening to stories. So please just be mindful of that and do what you can. If you need to step away or if you need to just do something to help yourself kind of regulate while you're engaged in the session, then please do so. Okay, Holly and Adam, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Claire. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I am meeting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people today. And Adam and I are going to have a bit of a yarn about Jay, who is a young Aboriginal boy with selective mutism. And we're going to talk about his journey to talking and eventual reunification with his mum. I have the privilege of being Adam's clinical supervisor. So we're basically going to have a conversation about the work that Adam has done with Jay and the support system around him. And we're going to really focus on the theme of stability, and how can we provide stability to a child who is experiencing instability. And in particular, we're going to talk about how culture can be a form of stability for Aboriginal children, families and community. And Jay's story also highlights how taking a collaborative and a multidisciplinary approach to the work can really enhance the outcomes for children and particularly help us to respond to that child's unique needs. So I'm going to hand over now to Adam, who'll tell us a little bit about Jay's story.
Thanks, Holly, and thank you, everybody. Hi, I'm Adam Dunn. I'm the clinical team leader of the Aboriginal team. I'm a proud Aboriginal man of Wurundjeri and Kamilaroi descent. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on various skies, lands and waterways around the country and pay my respects to elders past and present and all the young Aboriginal children that we work with. Firstly, what I'll do is I'll give you some insight into Jay. So I'll do a little bit of a synopsis on Jay's story. So I'll read to that, and then after I do that, Holly and I'll have a bit of a yarn about Jay. Feel free to ask questions if possible, and Claire will feed those through to us when she can. Jay's an Aboriginal boy who attends a local primary school in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. But unlike others in his class, he's only just started talking. Jay's mother's family has been badly affected by government policies since colonisation, invasion, particularly those that saw Aboriginal children forcibly removed from their parents and placed with non-Aboriginal families or in children's homes at the time. Both Jay's parents are heavy drug and alcohol users. His dad is very violent, especially towards mum, and they're both in their early 20s and both estranged from their families and culture. And when Jay was born, they had no contact with family at all. Jay's parents were homeless and squatting in an unused factory. As a baby and a small child, Jay was surrounded by drug-affected adults whose chaotic behaviour scared him. They also weren't able to give Jay the constant care and attention a small child needs. Had barely any interaction with other kids, and not much else is really known about what happened during the first 5 years of his life. Despite a very unstable home life and having never attended kinder, Jay started school. But right from the start, it was obvious that he was not okay. Jay frequently fell asleep in class. He would wander out of the classroom and off up the street, often looking for a feed. He'd never bring any food to school and was unusually small for his age. He would arrive at school on foot and alone. Jay was always wandering the streets alone at night. And after several notifications of risk to his safety, Child Protection removed Jay from the care of his parents. He was placed into the care of his maternal grandmother, one of the aunties, who I know very well, in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. When he was dropped off at her house, he came with nothing other than the clothes he was wearing. Having never met or seen Jay before, his grandmother and the aunties immediately noticed that he didn't speak. And it was not long after that that Jay was diagnosed as having selective mutism. For those of you who are not sure about selective mutism, it's an anxiety disorder where the person is so traumatised or anxious that they aren't able to speak. Some children aren't able to speak at school or in certain situations when they're anxious, but Jay, he wasn't able to speak at all. He didn't speak to anyone, not even at home, to grandmother and the aunties, or even his two cousins that he also lived with in the home. His grandmother also realised he appears not to know much about his culture, about his Aboriginality. He was referred by Child Protection to Berry Street's Take Two program, to us, for therapeutic intervention to assist him in his developmental and relationship struggles. And he still wasn't speaking. He didn't play with the kids at school, and he didn't even interact with his cousins at home. So for me, I started seeing Jay every week at his new school, and we would spend time together in the classroom after the other students and the teachers had left. I deliberately chose to have the sessions in the classroom to reduce his anxiety. Jay would likely feel in being in a new space with someone. And I was also aware that his experiences of men weren't great. And in fact, often they were quite scary and violent. In the first session with Jay, this is about 2 years ago, I simply sat reading in the corner of the classroom with Jay and flipped through books while talking to him. I kept it really casual and was careful not to make Jay feel as though he had to reply. Jay, of course, was unresponsive and wouldn't make eye contact with me, but he did seem to like looking at the books. So that was a good start. After a couple more sessions looking at the books and talking to Jay, I bought a box of Lego and started piecing bits together, encouraging Jay to do likewise. Jay picked out a Lego figurine with a helmet and a battle axe and a shield and kept twirling it around in his fingers. And I named that little fella Little Warrior Jay. And we built a little Aboriginal flag podium for him to stand on proudly. So you can see that on the image there that's in front of you. At the end of the sessions, Day didn't want to give up Little Warrior and put him back in the Lego box. So I went and got a small cardboard box and put Little Warrior inside and promised to keep him safe for Jay until the following week. And we still have Little Warrior with us as we speak today. Having never worked with a child with selective mutism before, I sought a secondary consultation with our Take 2 speech pathologist, Monica Rowland. She provided me with an understanding about the condition and some therapeutic techniques that I could try using with Jay. Monica also provided me with some visual communication cards and encouraged me to explain them to Jay so he could use them at school and at home in his communication. With what I knew about Jay, I created a new set specifically for him, incorporating his journey and culture. And I took him to the sessions with Jay and explained them to him, and separately explained them to his grandmothers and his teachers and all the professionals who engage with Jay on a weekly or daily basis, who also utilise the cards. And he seemed to like them and started to use them in the classroom and at home. Monica also suggested for me to read to Jay as much as you can. And I found the book From Little Things, Big Things Grow. And some of you may know it's the words of a song by Paul Kelly and Kev Carmody. But the book and the song is about a protest that led to the start of the Aboriginal lands rights movement, and is illustrated with arts created by the Gurindji kids from the land where the protest happened. When I started reading and singing, Jay started giggling and looking at my face for the first time. And it was the first time I heard him make a noise and make any eye contact. And I quickly realised that Jay had probably only ever heard his female teachers read him stories. And just to put it into perspective, I'm 6'1", big sort of, bald guy and strong. So I try to sort of make myself small and stuff. So I was really mindful of that when I was working with Jay. And at that point, I realised he'd never had a man be animated and sort of, be fun, I guess, in that space and reading books and trying to be soft and gentle. So in each session, I continued to read Aboriginal children's books to Jay that were recommended by our Aboriginal cultural consultant, Take 2, Kim Bradford. But Jay kept picking up From Little Things, Big Things Grow and handing it to me to read and, of course, sing again, which I won't be doing today. And it was clearly his favourite. And I would always also bring Little Warrior Jay and the box of Lego to the sessions and ask Little Warrior how his week had been, relating the questions to Jay's week at school and at home. And I only focused on Little Warrior, but I could see Jay at the corner of my eye starting to nod, shaking his head, smiling and being more expressive with his face. At home, Jay's grandmother and aunties immersed him in culture, just dosed him up with such rich, beautiful culture as part of his daily life. And they took him and his cousins when they went back to country for sorry business. And there he met more aunties, uncles and cousins. And they took him for some stories. They told him, for stories of his mob. And they filled his cup with cultural pride and identity. And as the months passed, I saw significant change for Jay. His whole affect changed. He was walking taller, his posture had changed. He started making eye contact and often and used a lot more gestures in his hands and grunting with approval or disapproval. And he started smiling and giggling a lot more. And later that year, when I started working with Jay, as the weather improved, I started having therapy sessions outdoors in the school garden with Jay. I had a sheet of paper with the names of birds, plants and insects in Jay's traditional language. And as we walked around the garden, I'd name mostly plants in English, and then I'd do my best, obviously, to pronounce them in language, and he'd laugh at me trying to actually pronounce the words. As the summer school holidays approached, I spoke to Jay about the Aboriginal the Aboriginal seasons, and that by watching the plants, animals, insects, and as well as the weather and the stars in the sky, you can see the seasons change. And not long before the holidays, after spending months with Jay, we were walking through the garden when I spotted what I thought was a butterfly. And I said to him, "Look, Jay, there's a butterfly." And in a small voice, Jay replied, "No, it's a moth." I was amazed to hear Jay's voice, but didn't break stride, because I remember Monica, our speech pathologist, telling me to normalise Jay's response and when he decided to, and when and if he decided to speak. And I didn't want to make Jay any more anxious and make a big deal out of the fact that he'd spoken. I so much wanted to pick him up and give him a big cuddle, but I couldn't do that. It was so hard to keep talking to him and act as though nothing had happened, but I had to turn direction and keep walking so he couldn't see the smile on my face. That was a big smile that day. It's a day I'll remember. For the rest of the session, Jay didn't say anything else, But in every session since then, he talks a little bit more. He's spoken to his teachers a few times now on a couple of occasions, and also engages with some of his classmates. His grandmother tells me now that big boy Jay talks up in the family home a lot more. And so from that, I know that it's culture that helped Jay find his voice. He's understanding who he is and where he fits in the world, and how he belongs with his mob, his kin, his family, and his country and culture. And I can see him every time I go back to see Jay. I can see him connecting with something bigger than him. I can see him feeling like he has a place in the world and an identity that he can connect with. But that's the story of Jay.
Thanks, Adam, for sharing Jay's story. And I've heard Jay's story many times over the last couple of years as I've supervised Adam with the work. I still get goosebumps listening to when Adam talks about how Jay first spoke. And I just love the fact that the motivation to speak actually came from telling Adam he was wrong about something. It's just such a beautiful, just shows how safe Jay felt in his relationship with Adam to actually be able to do that. So what we're going to do now is just have a bit of a conversation about how did instability present in Jay's story and in the system around him. So Adam, could you tell us a little bit about what was Jay's lived experience?
Yeah, well, as you know, if people could sort of take themselves back to the story of Jay, his lived experience was exposure to family violence, parental mental health, and parental substance misuse, and an obvious disconnection from his family, community, and his culture. And he also missed out on those developmental milestones that every young child has the right to, from his in utero experience all the way through to his relational health with, family, community, kin, his parents, right up to the age of 5. Jay missed out on a lot of those milestones. He never had opportunity, that nature nurture sort of experience, or, that primary attachment with his mother as well. And he had an environment of insecurity, and there weren't many safe adults in his life. And there's still, to this day, sadly, a lot of unknown things, that we don't know what happened to Jay, but we know that some of them weren't great. And a lot of that experience is obviously evident in his selective mutism.
Yeah. So Jay's lived experience was really, there was no stability for him in relationships. There was no sense of belonging, and there was no sense of being safe. So he really did have instability across all areas of his life when Adam started working with him. And Adam, what was happening, I guess, for the family and the community around Jay? What were we seeing in terms of instability there?
Yeah, well, there was experiences, ruptures in relationships, conflicting loyalties particularly around the kinship placement, that presented some difficulties for the grandmother and for the extended family as well, because of the nature of the placement. She'd cared for, Jay's mum previously to that. So that created a lot of instability within the family. There were a lot of, through that and through, the work that we did, there were a lot of fractured relationships experienced through the family. And to understand families in the context of the work that we do, particularly as Aboriginal people, there's a lot spoken about cultural load, and we've got, the families that I work with sometimes, and particularly this family, a very significant family and community. And when I say significant family and community, well-known elders who are in community, but also people who hold positions, working for local government agencies and the ACOs, the Aboriginal-led organisations. So, there's that sort of balance of trying to, hold that professional space with families and sort of being able to support those families and being able to hold, their privacy as well.
Yeah. And I think that's something we see quite frequently when we do have children in kinship placements, whether with an Aboriginal or a non-Aboriginal child. It can create conflicting relationships within that family unit when a child goes to live with another family member. And we need to sort of think about making sure we are supporting the carer so that they're able to actually provide that stability to the child as well.
Yeah.
And Adam, what were the professionals saying?
Well, as you know, you could imagine, risk of safety for Jay. And I think it wasn't even so much what they were seeing, Holly. It was also around the anxiety that was within the system, and it was, at that point, because there'd been, no notifications on Jay from until basically he was at school. So, the first 5 years of his life, there's a lot of unknowns. So, there was a lot of anxiety that was in that space, and it was also about, who's holding the risk. Everyone was thinking, well, who holds the risk? To Take Two hold some of that risk, obviously child protection, and other services that were involved.
Mm.
And again, the fractured relationships with the professionals and families, that sort of parallel process of, because, you got to understand again, around intergenerational experiences of families with accessing services, particularly, when you've got aunties living and grandmother living with Jay who are part of Stolen Gen, and their experiences of services like ours, and a lot of service historically. There are a lot of things that happened, and there's a lot of repair, and there's a lot of mistrust with services, from, understandably, particularly from some of the older members of the community as well.
Mm. So I guess in the face of that, instability and that anxiety, how did the service system respond to that instability, and what challenges came up for you?
I think, look, initially, I think the first, it wasn't really a response, but it was a lack of cultural knowledge and consideration in working with this family. And like I said, a significantly well-known family, who are so rich of cultural knowledge, and wisdom. That was, a response that wasn't there initially at the start, and that led to sort of a lack of communication. So, you know, people weren't, we've probably all heard about talking and working in silos. There were different, services providing different, levels of support, but the communication across the service system was quite poor at the time. And then, like I just said, different services working towards different goals and priorities.
That's like what Sandra and Morel were talking about in the session earlier today, about those different lenses, and people come to the work looking at it from their particular lens. But we actually need to look at it from those multiple lenses.
Yeah, and that's right, like Holly. And I always, when I consult with other clinicians at Take Two who are working with other Aboriginal children and families, is to have a dual lens, have a dual approach. I will always advocate, and we'll speak to that a bit more, culture first, because of the therapeutic benefits of culture, but you also need that clinical approach as well. So, when we go into these spaces, it's really important to make sure, if you want to work in communities, that you immerse yourself in that space and understand the communities as well, because no two communities are the same. Communities across Victoria and Australia, there's all different. There's a whole lot of different, different language groups, different dreaming. There's some similarities, of course, but there are vast differences between communities. So as you go into community, it's important to make sure you immerse yourself in that space and understand the community as well.
Mm. And so I guess, Adam, in the context of, this, Jay's story, it's very complex. There's a lot of risk, there's a lot of anxiety. How did you engage
with the family? So with our engagement, as an Aboriginal clinician, like, firstly, I engage with the family to build trust around, cultural safety, to be clear about the work that we do at Take Two. So to really let, the family and the parents and the carers and community, because I spent a lot of time, obviously not recently because of COVID, but in the community space as well. So they're really clear about the work that we can and can't do at Take Two. But it's also important to listen to the needs of the family, get cultural feedback, because, Aboriginal families, particularly traditional Aboriginal families, child rearing practices are different, and work out who I should speak to within the family and the community, and that sort of that structural therapy approach, again, which we'll talk to later, and make sure there's collaboration with the Aboriginal families that we work with, because it's about building trust. And then, the school and professionals to provide feedback from the family and the community. So that's the first thing I do. It's sort of, put family first. and to engage with all who are supporting Jay, including his teachers, support workers, so from the very start, as a clinician, we're already building that therapeutic web around a child, around Jay, and engaging with all the adults in his life with a shared therapeutic plan. So we're thinking about that from the very start. And what we wanted to do is build the relational health of the adults around children. It's really important, so that the safe and trusted adults are clear about the important role that they play. We want to dose our kids with positive experiences. And we know that starts with healthy, safe relationships of the adults, both at home and the professionals we work with. To understand, the child's needs. And we want to understand that, a good cultural and therapeutic environment starts to build resilience for kids, and identity and a sense of safety. And it begins the healing process from the start.
Mhm. And it sounds like you're sort of illustrating the point really nicely that when we are working with a child who does present with a lot of instability, the first therapeutic task often is to create the stability around the child in the people that are supporting the child, and making sure that they're in a place where they're actually able to provide the support that the child needs.
Yeah, and I think it's also, Holly, just having them understand their role, their responsibility, and the impact that everybody can have on a child. From the moment Jay's feet hit the floor in the morning and he gets up, what are we doing? What's the transitions between home and school look like? And back home again. Making sure that everybody, the adults that are involved are invested, and that they understand that everyone plays a part. Therapy could represent 45 minutes of the week. That's not the bit that's going to support and provide healing for our kids. It's everybody. We need buy-in from the whole therapeutic web, the whole system that sits around a child.
Yep. So Adam, could you tell us a little bit about why your approach to working with Jay wasn't just to engage in one-on-one therapy with him?
Yeah, well, we often know that children that we work with aren't ready for individual therapy. Their chronological age and and their emotional development age, it's different. And that's what we sort of look at, in the work that we do with the NMT, which is neurosequential model of therapeutics. So, poor in utero experiences, lack of safe relationships from birth, and they haven't been provided an environment where they can grow and meet the developmental milestones, which was obviously evident that what I spoke about a little bit earlier with Jay. So we know, again, the richness of good relational health, and we speak to that in the neurosequential model of therapeutics, NMT, about good, healthy relationships to build good, healthy neural pathways to facilitate and support good, brain development. But also with that, I think, and I know through my experience, that Mob have been doing that for a long time. We talk good cultural health for kids equals good, safe, healthy relationships, sense of identity. So, we know that to provide therapy for these kids, we need to make sure that we start at the beginning and get a really good sense of what's needed for them. And that's not just therapy itself. That's about the safe, predictable, healthy relationships.
Yeah. So it's not the traditional therapy as we know it, with sort of, the clinician and the child in the room for an hour once a week. But, it was actually engaging through culture.
Yeah.
And providing a space for Jay to feel a positive sense of identity and belonging.
Yeah.
Was a really sort of first foundation stone for the work.
That's right. And we understand, the kids we work with, Holly, don't we, that, kids in the resi care units and the out-of-home care space, they haven't had an opportunity, particularly, I'm talking to the space of Aboriginal families and my communities that I work with, often these kids don't have a sense of who they are, not only not knowing who mum and dad are, but not only knowing who they are and their, through their culture and their connection to the community and extended family and country. So it's really, really important.
Yep. And once you've done some work to sort of establish, a really solid, stable base of culture for Jay and sort of having all that work in motion. Can you tell us a bit about, I guess, how you looked at developing the relationships around Jay and for Jay?
Yeah, well, as we've spoken about, it's around building stability and trust. And earlier I mentioned that as I mentioned, as a Take Two clinician, we're working towards supporting healthy relationships around the child and seeking out and supporting relationships around the children over a period of support over time at Take Two. So it's about, pacing the support and being really reflective and less reactive. And what we're hoping to do at Take Two, and the work that we do as clinicians is leave a web of culture and positive, safe and trusted relationships for a child, because it's important. And we know that we're not around forever. We luckily have time that we can spend with families and children community. And again, being an Aboriginal clinician, just because I close with one family doesn't mean I'm not working somehow indirectly with that family or the aunties that again as well. So it's, I need to be mindful of that. And equally with a child like Jay, we like I said, we need to take our time and move to, his rhythm, and slow everything down, to reading the books and just being sitting beside Jay. Like the first 6 months, I just was with and beside and not looking, not making eye contact. I spoke to his culture and I spoke to mine as well, lots of storytelling. And just making those connections, those safe connections, and being consistent. He knew every Thursday I would be at the school, so just making sure that he was aware of that. And he'd come sort of looking, and he knew the time. But that again wasn't something that just happened and couldn't be forced. It happened over a period of 6 months and beyond.
Adam, we did have a question from someone in the group about how you navigated things like school holidays and your own leave, times when you couldn't be there every Thursday. How did you manage that with Jay?
Yep. I guess it's one thing, that I've been with Berry Street 7 years, Take Two 6 years now, I think, Claire. And one thing I've learned is really around the pacing of my work. I'm a fixer, I like to fix things, but to slow things down, and the reflective space of Take Two provides an opportunity to be thinking about and thinking beyond that. So, from the day I start with Jay, I'm planning out, looking at the work that I'll be doing. I'm thinking about the school holidays. So prior to the school holidays, I'm talking to Jay about it. I'm talking with Auntie about it. And it might even just be a phone call to Auntie over the holidays to check in. I guess it's about trying to leave kids with the thought that you're always holding them in mind, that they know that you're being held. And that was, little Jay was a good example of that. That a lot of times, not just with Jay, but other kids I work with, I like to make something symbolic, particularly the Aboriginal kids. So it's something they can take home. And so it sort of sits with them, but it's got to come back. It has to come back. So that's, they're building that trust. So just little things like that to know that, particularly over the Christmas holidays, it's a little bit more difficult. And I might see a child once or twice over that period, but yeah, that's what I aim to do.
And when we're working with children who are presenting with a lot of instability in their life, it's often important for us to think of how can we capitalise on the strengths and the areas of stability that they might have. And Adam, I know you made some really conscious decisions about choosing to meet with Jay at school. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I met with him each week at school and started in the classroom. And again, this comes from, opportunities for me having good supervision. Thank you, Holly. But being able to be really reflective in the space as we go into the work each week, we have supervision and we're thinking about what's coming next and what we could sort of do to create safety for the kids that we work with. So I'd met him at the start, as I mentioned in the story, on the beanbag, reading books, and that was with no kids in the classroom as well. And I engaged with the other children in the class when they would approach. Both Jay and myself, so he could observe my behaviour and interactions with the other kids. And he sort of he gave him time to make sense of me. So as much as I'm, sitting there, doing an MSc, a mental state examination, trying to, observe and watch children, I'm equally giving him the opportunity to observe and watch me and try to make sense of me and see my interactional patterns with the adults, with the teachers, with his mum at the gate if she was there, or a carer, or the other kids, and he gets to make more sense of me, but again over time.
Yeah. And I think particularly for kids in out-of-home care, if they are attending school, because we obviously know a lot of kids are disengaged from education, but if the child is attending school, that is often a really stable, safe place for a child to be. So engaging with therapeutic services in the school environment can be really beneficial to that child, because they feel safe and they can actually then effectively engage in the work.
And I just want to say one more thing on that, Holly, too. Again, for those people who work in community, immerse yourself and dose yourself up with culture and be culturally curious, because you need to be seen. So again, COVID's made that space difficult, but kids need to be seeing us, on the Sorry Day March. They need to be seeing us at public events, having a sausage or a yarn with, the community elders where possible, because we're going to be interacting and moving through different spaces with these kids. So, as a clinician or as a professional working in the community space, you need to be seen. Not sort of blowing in and out, because a lot of community members, how long is this fella going to be around for? Is he going to be here for 5 minutes, or is he going to be here for an extended period of time? But if you're seen in different spaces, you're building that trust and that connection, and that only, will support the richness of the work that you do with the families and the children of the families that we work with as well.
Adam, there was a question from Jackie in the thread. She was commenting that often she's found in her role that they come up with resistance with schools not actually wanting the kids to sort of step out of classes to engage in, other workers' work. And, she tries to explain the reasons why, but often it's really problematic. Did you have any, suggestions about how to get schools on board with understanding that, doing the work in the school context is really helpful?
Yeah, Jackie, really hard with some schools, absolutely agree. And I'm still presented with some difficulties now with some of the schools that I work in. But I think what works for me, and I get a good strike rate, is the education about culture and families from the onset with the school. So that's about being led by the child and the family, and the school understanding, the benefits for the child's education to be able to build those safe relationships. Because if we can support and regulate children and have them, as more active participants in the classroom, then it's only going to, provide further support for the classroom teacher, but most importantly for the young person. So I find that conversation at the very start really important to, particularly for, principals who are quite resistant, to understand in the context of the importance of the work that we're doing, which will again facilitate and support the work that they do. I've got good relationships with a lot of schools, but some schools are still a work in progress. Absolutely. Yeah.
So we might move on just to having a bit of a conversation. So I'm just aware of time, and we could talk about Jay's story for hours. Adam's done so much beautiful work with Jay and the family around him. But what actually worked working with Jay?
Well, there you can see some of the cards that we did, basic, but that really gave Jay a really lovely opportunity and a safe way to communicate, and just to acknowledge the times when he felt tired. So he could actually go off and have a snooze in class when he'd point to his card for the teacher, and if he didn't know something, not shame jobbing him, not sort of, him to be able to have the opportunity to say, I don't know, and he could point to his card. So we did, like as I mentioned earlier, some of those cards in a way that was, sort of spoke to Jay's story a little bit as well. I could speak to those cards for a long time, but I won't. But, we talked about his totems and, his own cultural sort of identity as well, and utilize them as a communication. Bringing in other professionals' perspectives, i.e. communications cards, was really, really important. And sharing a consistent approach across key people, the services, the school, providing the psychoeducation for those reluctant, principals, Jackie, and learning to seek consult from specialists, and we're blessed at Take Two. And I feel very privileged to work there because we have access to so many other professionals that only facilitate and support the work that we can do as clinicians. So, you know, we've got OTs and we've got neuropsychs, and you know, we've recently had an access to a paediatrician. So, you know, really sort of valuable consultations that we can utilize to support our work. You know, and speaking, you know, once we're having other assessments done, like a neuropsych assessment done, you know, being able to speak to the results and the recommendations from the reports to the family, you know, in a way that, you know, people who are, you know, not in the clinical space understand. You know, and including professionals, and supporting Jay to have a shared approach again in care and, you know, across the service sector. So not just getting a report and shelving a report. And I think I heard Morel speak earlier that we want all the reports because we want to make sense of a child, and we want to make sense of their experience, and we want to hear what the other professionals are saying, and we want to start to see some of those themes. I think also what worked, Holly, was, you know, meeting children like Jay where they're safe, and, you know, building on, you know, cultural engagement in the outdoors. Example, you know, reading in language and having a go, you know, and just, you know, taking a risk of being a little bit, you know, silly and clunky around things. You know, I think that's really important. You know, and just slow down. You know, it's not a race. We're governed by, you know, time. But, you know, if you want to, again, you know, with mob and community, we really do need to slow the pace down, because it's not how it works. You know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, working from a cultural and clinical perspective, Holly, you know, dual approach. So, you know, be culturally curious, understand the beneficial, the therapeutic benefits of culture. Mob have been doing it for a long time. If you really turn and look, you'll see, you know, that will facilitate and support you in your work. And demonstrating, you know, healthy, safe relationships. You know, bringing in other, you know, for Jay, he had poor experiences of men, and not specifically just Aboriginal men, but he, you know, bringing in other Aboriginal male adults that I know in the service sector to work with Jay, him watching us yarning up and talking about things, and, you know, having, you know, a kick of the football or laughing and just enjoying each other, men, you know, as men, being, you know, being emotional, you know, not being angry, being able to, you know, talk and communicate and spend time with Jay where he felt safe with you know, particularly with men.
So you were able to give him an example of a positive adult male role model, and someone that Jay could look up to and think about who he might want to be in the future, as a different example of what he might have experienced, seeing men as being in the past.
Yeah, that's right, Holly. And also, again, you know, thinking forward, it's about what will we leave Jay with as we exit as take two, and making sure that I'm still doing the work with other men, who, you know, have an opportunity to repair and be the facilitators of intergenerational change themselves because of their early childhood experiences of trauma, to support Jay and see the beautiful work that they're doing as well. So to fill their cup up too. And I think that's, you know, one thing that we miss sometimes. You know, and connection to culture. I cannot advocate for that enough. You know, for a sense of identity and, you know, and being longing to, you know, something that's bigger than you, you know, community, you know, having culture as a stable base, for Jay during his placement was just, you know, that was so important. And as I saw him change and his posture change and his sense of identity and him knowing who he was, you know, what, you know, I'm trying not to say where he's from, but the group he's from, the mob he's from, and to understand that, you know, there's some amazingly significant people throughout history in that community that he's connected with, you know, politically, musically, and just thinking, wow, I can be that person. It's really, really important. And systems work, you know, to implement a shared approach and strategies. So he had consistency across his, you know, the therapeutic web in his day and his week. And as I mentioned earlier, for people to understand that everyone has a role to play, in supporting kids like Jay, and also supporting you know, supporting the family in a culturally safe and respectful manner to increase stability. You know, and holding the family in culture so they can hold the child, you know, for them, not just within community understand, because they know how important that is, and they know how well that is, but also for them to have a voice and be powerful in a way where they're representing the child in the professional space, so that the people working with the children in a professional capacity, they become the students. They start to learn. They start to see why it's important that we speak about Aboriginal children remaining with Aboriginal carers and community, because it is so important. And I think, again, what's a lovely thing that we do is, we slow the pace down, and we're safe, and we're predictable. And I think that really does work.
It's so important. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've had a bit of a chat about what's worked well in your work with Jay. What were some of the dilemmas that you faced working with him, and how did you respond to them?
So I guess, like managing and responding to anxiety, in the family system and with workers, and
And
building.
with your supervisor, I remember I had anxiety around the
that's amazing.
reunification for Jay, and and so did you, Adam. And we had to talk through that in supervision about what that was about and how we could manage that, so we could then support the other workers with Jay to be less anxious.
Yeah, and that was about understanding mum, and I remember that in the context of her own trauma and her own experiences as a child, and being in out of home care and having multiple carers, and he was a beautiful woman who had her battles, but worked hard, to address some of what had happened, but it's about, we talk about kids and we see the behaviour. The system was really looking at the behaviour of mum. But not looking. And I remember a moment in an AFLDM, which is an Aboriginal family-led decision-making meeting. I remember sitting there, when I think about it, I remember seeing mum sitting there she hadn't seen Jay for a while, and trying to engage with him. And I watched her, and it was really, she just wanted to, I just wanted to say, bend down and pick him up and cuddle him, because I can see that's what you want to do, mum. I mean, as a father, I know that's what I want to do with my kids. But she just didn't know how to, to get on the floor and sit with him. And that was a moment I thought, we really need to think about mum, and the importance of this reunification is around skilling up and encouraging and supporting mum to be a wonderful mother, because she had all the ingredients for it. But she just didn't know how to do it. She never had parents who sat beside her and played with the Lego. She never had parents, she was so worried and distracted by the professionals and people sitting around that space that she forgot just about being a mum, But, other dilemmas were building trust in the family and the professional system around Jay, and the anxiety around reunification that you'd mentioned. They were some of the dilemmas that sat there as well. But and I think really around developing a shared understanding of the child as well, being child-led. And I think I'd heard something mention that earlier. I don't know if that was when we were yarning outside of this space or not, but I know someone mentioned being child-led, and it's really important to sort of listen and watch and get a sense of what the child's needs are, slowing the system down, and allowing kids like Jay to be immersed in culture and therapeutic support, and building the relationships that are safe, and it takes time, it does take time.
Yep. And as a clinician, it can be difficult to sit in the space of thinking, what is the child's lived experience? Because it actually is a challenging space to be in. And sometimes we do get caught up in that wanting to fix things and do things. But it's so important to slow down and actually think, what is actually happening for this child, and what does this child need? It's such an important sort of space to create.
And just, and obviously confidentiality too is really difficult, particularly when you working with adult services, and we're looking at reunification with mum, and then trying to engage with adult therapeutic services, what we can and we can't talk about, but really trying to again get that buy-in from everybody to understand that if we work together, and we have a shared approach. And luckily for me, the woman that was working with Jay's mum, she was a clinical, I think she was a family therapist as well. So what we thought we would do is we would have shared sessions together. So we actually sat, so I introduced her, like Jay never come to some of the individual sessions with mum. So I sat and we had some family therapy sessions as well. So we had a dual approach, and that sort of worked really well and sort of built those bridges for not only the professionals, but also for the family as well, as we started the process of being able to reunificate Jay to mum.
Mm.
And I think one more thing I do want to say about that dilemmas is always holding the idea of the intergenerational traumas and the impacts of history on families that we work with. It's not that long ago that a lot of these things happened, and things still happen, but that's a whole other conversation, I guess, Holly. But
Yeah, we could talk about that one for
yeah,
hours.
yeah, I can.
So you've talked quite a bit about working with other professionals while you were working with Jay. How did the collaboration help achieve positive outcomes for him?
It was around a sort of multidisciplinary approach. It's important as professionals to learn ways to engage with kids in many different ways. An example is, if you think back to the communications cards that, Monica and I had spoken about, and just ways of engagement with Jay, because, I would have probably, when he spoke for the first time, like I said, I wanted to pick him up, but that was not the thing to do. It would have been really anxiety provoking for Jay. But so by collaborating with our speech pathologist, I was able to engage with Jay using the cards, normalizing the interactions and feedback to Jay. It'd be like, oh, I think what you're trying to tell me, and when he nods with approval or disapproval, all those sort of things, just, having that as a normal reciprocal way of, communicating and having that beautiful rhythm with a child, with not trying to force anything more than sort of trying to get to the end goal where we want to get, and acknowledging his body language, his smile and his laughter, and again, building, some of the trust in that with Jay around those things.
Adam, we had there was a question in the chat thread a little while back that relates to what you just talked about then, where someone was curious about I guess the strategies that Monica, our speech pathologist, sort of helped you to think about in terms of how to respond to Jay helpfully. Were you then able to share those specific sort of strategies with, say, the school and other people in Jay's life, so that they understood that as well?
Yeah, absolutely, Claire, because again, that was the important value. Again, internally, the consultation at Take Two is so wonderful. We're so lucky. You can have a cultural consultation with our team. You can, seek consultation with Monica and, our neuropsych Anna, and, all so on and so forth. But then the important bit about that is to feed it back to those who are supporting the child, for them to understand that, yeah, we're going to get excited. If we do hear his voice and we get excited, let's just normalize it, and let's not, make him feel anxious about it. And, there are ways to, we can communicate and acknowledge Jay, and even the way, I spoke to little Jay, the little, figurine we made, and I could see him, and he'd look and he'd giggle and he'd laugh, and I'd, be all animated and talking to little Jay, but that's just safe for him. He could make sense of me. So really important to do that, but also to feed what I did and what's working for me back to everyone else that is working with the child as well, with Jay. So we're all on board and doing similar things and getting good feedback. And what that does is you get the phone call from Arnie, or you get the phone call from another worker, and you have that really beautiful conversation and that laugh about what's going on and happening for Jay. And we're all having little wins and sharing in that together as carers and as professionals, and we're building strength in that web. We're building strength across, the with the adults that are working with him, and again, it's around that shared goal of trying to support a child and getting some clarity around knowing that it's so important that everybody plays a role. So I went a bit long-winded there, Claire, but yes, feedback is important because of that.
Yeah. And I think that highlights, in any healthy relationship, communication is essential. And so when we are doing that collaborative work with a therapeutic web, it's making sure that we do have that clear, consistent communication, and sometimes providing some psychoeducation to people who might not be in the clinical space, so they understand why a child's doing what they are. And I think ultimately, when we sort of look at what does that mean for Jay's lived experience, it means that he's actually got consistency in the adults around him and how they're responding to him and how they're understanding him. And that really helps to increase his sense of stability and predictability in the world, which is so important.
Yeah. And it's sort of, I guess it also just demonstrates our systems approach to working with a child or family. Going through like placement instabilities and changes can support and manage the transition while, working to maintain a sense of stability for the child and the consistency of care approaches across different settings, and connection to culture. I always flip it. And even when we're writing our reports, my first recommendations come in that cultural space. And I hope that people are starting to get a sense of the richness and the importance, particularly around the relational health, and providing, that the foundations of the doing the scaffolding, but it starts with identity, and that's where culture plays a really, really big role of the foundational work, to build up those strong, healthy relationships with self, with community, with adults, with other kids, and with identity as well.
Mm-hmm. So we're down to our last 5 minutes now. So Adam, just reflecting, I guess, on the work that you've done with Jay and the journey that you've taken with him, what would be a couple of sort of key trauma-minded practice approaches that you'd like people to take away with them in terms of thinking about how can they help increase stability for a child?
I think for all children, a sense of identity is really important. Today, we speak to the space that I work in with the communities that I'm privileged to work with. Culture, connection, identity, and it equals healing. Being a family therapist, I work very systemically with families and the systems. So, I'm making sure that I'm thinking about everyone who sits around the child. Thinking more broadly and beyond, those immediately that are sitting around Jay. There was an image we had earlier, which I wish I'd sort of spoken to, but and I think that it's very similar to Bronfenbrenner's ecological system theory. Hopefully I spat that out all right. But thinking broadly about who's sitting around a child. So we sometimes will sit there and we will actually go with families with the circles. We'll put the child in the middle and we start to see the proximity of everyone, where everyone sits. And people will say, oh, VACA, Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency are involved. Well, we start to see proximity, where they're sitting and why. How do we bring them in a little bit more and get them closer? There might be an auntie or an uncle or someone significant in the child who's either close or not close enough. And we start to, really think systemically about who's around the children, and even beyond our episode, the episode with Take Two, who we can bring in closer at that time. And obviously, structural family approach is always important. And in a nutshell, thinking structurally is about, particularly in community, sometimes hierarchically, who sits where, who's doing what, who are the decisions makers for this child. That's why it's important to be child and family led. But, not all mobs work the same, and family structures and systems look a little different. So we need to be thinking about who we're going to speak to. I might be indirectly speaking to one of the uncles at one of the health services, and he might be yarning up and telling me about, little Jay, and he's an important person, even though he's not biologically Jay's uncle, but he's a significant person in his life. So I need to really start to think about who are those important people structurally that sit around a child as well. And of course, NMT, a trauma-informed approach, the impacts on, someone like Jay's the early opportunities that were missed for emotional and cognitive development, and what we can do now, to build those healthy neural pathways, to provide healthier relational templates for our kids, and support their cognitive development. If we've got healthy, relational templates for our kids, we've got more regulated kids, we've got kids who are more active and more able to participate, in the classroom, in their learning. So there's some of the things, Holly, I guess, that I hope people can take away from today.
Yep. And it's quite fascinating that the reality is the more we can create structure and stability for a child in their relationships and in their community, that actually translates to more structure and stability in their brain at a neural level. So it's such a crucial part of the work that we do.
I love that. I'm probably going to, but I know Claire a long time ago. Claire's our guru. She's amazing, and with the NMT stuff. But we had a traumatized brain and a non-traumatized brain, and really like a roadmap, and really, around neural pathways, and kids just not even able to get to the places they need to for self-regulation. And I guess what we say is, we build those strong, healthy relationships. We start to build strong, healthy neural pathways so the kids can get to where they need to go, to regulate themselves, to be actively able to participate in class and not be preoccupied with stress and worry and anxiety, and to understand that there are some safe adults and people around them, and to, build that beautiful web around them so they can, have those, opportunities, to like any other kid should have,
Thanks, Adam.
Okay.
And thank you so much for presenting Jay's story today. It's been wonderful to hear it again. And thank you for the work that you've done with Jay. Thank you also to Claire for your beautiful facilitation of these sessions today.
Thanks, Claire.
And I'd also like to thank Jay, our little warrior, and just his amazing journey. It's been such a privilege to sit with Adam and learn about that. And Jay might be a very quiet young boy at times, but he's got a lot of strength and he's very tenacious. And I think, I've learned a lot from hearing about his story. So thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, Holly, and thank you, Adam. Sorry to those people who may have posed questions that we mightn't have been able to get to, but I think you probably got the flavour of the responses anyway. All the best, everyone. Our next session starts at 1 p.m. So we've got a break now for an hour. Those of you who are coming back, see you at 1 p.m. Those of you who weren't planning on coming back but would like to, you're welcome. It's the same Zoom link, so you can just use the same Zoom link to come back to the subsequent sessions this afternoon. And the next session will be on sort of focusing on assessment in particular in Take 2. So we'll look forward to seeing you then.